Well, hello, everybody. Casey and I are happy to have you all back from your breakout rooms. We'd love to hear your recaps of your breakout sessions now. Should you be ready to share, who would like to go first? I think, Kent, we have you up first if you'd like to.
Okay. Well, so clearly, the half hour or so is not a huge amount of time, but we had a robust discussion. So a couple key things. In terms of short-term goals, we recognized, and this as a reminder, this breakout session was focusing on response. So we understand that and in the COVID situation, there have been a lot of responses that have been going on. We understand and we've seen that the personnel involvement, whether it's professional, government, nonprofit, or the community involvement in these sorts of things could be better. And so this really focuses on training. And it's not just physicians. It's the whole continuum focusing on One Health, and because we're focusing on One Health for this exercise, it's important to understand what are the human resources that we really have, and as important, what do we think we need? And of course, that's probably a little bit more unknowable. And I think having better monitoring on international monitoring on public health capacities and spendings, there's no data. And then risk communication clearly is important. One of the, as was mentioned by a couple of people, blind spots, certainly in the One Health arena, and I think we all recognize this, is that so often agriculture is not present, and so it's sort of an afterthought. We hear about agriculture when there's a famine and drought, and then it kind of recedes into the background. And I think yet we all recognize the importance of health, of food security. And then this really merges into the longer term aspect, and that is, how do you mobilize the community? This involves education. It involves, the concept of enhancing the concept of citizen science, which includes surveillance, health literacy improvement, and it's not just the physicians. It's not just the veterinarians. It's really to be successful. It's the whole of society. Obviously, that's easier said than done. But this broad engagement is really important. And then sort of anytime initiatives are established, it's not just a concept of throwing money at it. That's often a feel-good thing. Hey, we just threw $1 trillion at something, but you really have to be able to evaluate, what did you do, and how good was it? Is it meeting the needs? Does it need to be improved? Does it need to be stopped? And so how do you analyze that data? And so that this is not just a one-shot deal, that it really is a dynamic process of response, that really plays out both short-term and long-term. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to whomever is next.
I think Maureen.
Thank you, Donna. We had a lively discussion, and we could have gone on for another 2 hours, but our focus was on data, the availability of the data, the quality of the data, and the use of data for decision making. And so in that context, our short-term goals were, one, to create a One Health surveillance system by beginning to take all the disparate silo-driven systems that are in place, whether they are particularly in more advanced countries, and beginning to create one platform. Secondly, make use of a single integrated IT platform that takes us beyond single systems into a more integrated piece. Therefore, from a longer-term perspective, what the idea is to create an iterative and an integrated surveillance system that goes beyond traditional data and takes into account social media data, and has as one of the important pillars participatory surveillance, and that links very much with citizen science. Create a space where data will improve in quality, will be operationalized at the local level, so that local public health is really the nidus of decision making, and where that at that level where implementation of decisions can be made. Where preparedness is the time to invest in surveillance systems rather than while we're going on in response. And with the focus of One Health, where it's critical that in some places, particularly in LMICs, where we're not burdened by silo-driven approaches to surveillance and detection, that those places might give us an opportunity to do more innovation. The panel was also mentioned also very importantly the notion that we need to have clear and trustful communicators, and that communication in general is very critical. So integrated, we're looking at, in summary, we're looking at bringing together the disparate surveillance systems, creating a long-term iterative and interactive surveillance system, making use of a common IT platform, and integrating participatory surveillance. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, bring us home.
Sorry, we're highly efficient because we were last to be asked. So we've got a slide together. And what we came up with is sort of 3 bucket areas, and there are short-term and long-term issues within this. First of all, on data collection. So to really get the forecasting, the predictive innovations into business as usual, we're going to have real-time genomic data in a pipeline that's shareable, and that's not easy to do, and that's a challenge. Better data sets on human activities, the things that drive all this on the interface that just aren't there right now. Things like the wildlife trade, where we know it's going on, we know roughly where it's going on, but we don't have real data. And Greg Glass came up with the idea of a sort of low-level collection of data that's acceptable instead of invasive in everyday life, a bit like weather forecasting that goes on, that people appreciate, but don't actually get an invasion into their privacy with, at least that they know of. On the second big issue, education and culture, it's pretty clear that education at every level needs to happen around One Health to explain to the public why these things matter, so that then when we try and drive the funding, that they actually support it. But in a university level, interprofessional education, bringing in things like data analytics, law, economics into One Health are critical. Building the centers of interdisciplinary excellence that Lonnie talked about. And then on the culture side, a better way for society to value health and the drivers of health, including nature, biodiversity, ecosystem services, not just GDP or per capita GDP spent on healthcare. We need more than that. We need a deeper understanding so that we appreciate the value of One Health issues. And improving health systems globally, so that where we do predict and accurately find these small outbreaks, there's actually a system in place to identify the first cases and deal with it. And then finally, a really big issue around the predictive approaches are often research generated. They're generated in academic research. They're cool, innovative, but are they then used? And there's a lot of pushback, and it's not in a negative way. It's really from Barbara Hahn brought this up. It's really from policymakers where they're not sure how accurate those predictions are going to be. They're going to go back in the agencies to a comfortable strategy, which is often business as usual. So to really change, we need to quantify risk better, work creatively with data that are often lacking or not good enough, make predictions that are useful to policy makers and agencies. For instance, on where they can target their work, what species they should be looking at. And really importantly, if we're going to find a lot of new microbes, we need to have some sort of system, and Jonna talked to this in some of her recent work, on how we can triage that to find out which ones are most important. And there's work in AMR, antimicrobial resistance, and in coronaviruses where you can show that from sequence data, you can get predictions that are valuable, that can be used. And then finally, there's an incredible growth in the idea of using wearable or sensor type technologies linked to mobile phones, better communication of health on the ground. And it's often sort of pushed to one side because we think it won't be picked up globally. Well, we don't need to chase every new gadget, but where there is pickup, especially in regions where new diseases are beginning, of these sorts of approaches, it could be extremely useful for getting better predictions. So that's our summary, and we'll share that with you, John, for the report. Cheers.
Thank you so much. I would like to just ask a few questions coming in from the participants to all of you panelists. So it'll be a little bit difficult because there's so many of you wonderful minds here. If you want to indicate with your reactions, your raised hands on who would like to start some of these questions, but I felt like we had some really good input there from all of your sessions. And one of the things that came through clearly here that I think gets limited attention and that we really need to focus on is that we need to incorporate more social science into One Health and making sure that the social scientists are really feeling welcome, safe, and can contribute significantly. Without understanding the societal drivers and being able to communicate that, we're really not going to make the progress that we want to make. So, Catherine, I see you nodding your head. Would you like to weigh in? And then I'll go to Olga.
Yeah, thank you. It's such an important point. I think, One Health will always have to be context specific. So the relevant partners to bring in will really depend on the context that you're working in, the community you're working in, the scale. I think that's really exciting in terms of behavioral economics and designing appropriate interventions that communities are going to not only accept, but, really lead on and be the owners of and the models for. And I think there are some great examples from the Predict project of the Living Safely with Bats book, where that was a visual tool and really used to engage communities and be really honest about consumption practices, exposures, and be practical about the solutions. I think that is needed on a much larger scale, and it's such an important area. And it just bringing in that group of social scientists from all around the world and artists and all these other fields that don't fit into the three key disciplines, I think the sky is the limit. Yeah, thank you.
Olga, would you like to make a comment in this area?
Yeah, I think this is definitely to the benefit of sort of public health to bring in the social scientists, because ultimately, it's very much behavior what drives the costs of these outbreaks and what drives the lack of prevention. And here, I think it's very much linked to how robust the core public health systems are. If we manage to improve the surveillance and the diagnostic capacities and the analytic capacities for public health in across the world in countries as is needed for the health security, then it will be much easier for people to become engaged constructively. Because right now, what you see again and again, even in wealthy countries where this shouldn't really be the case, is that the data don't exist, or the data are poor. It's very confusing. People jump in with their own sort of modeling of what the epidemic. So that's very much to the detriment of the response and of public health over the long term. So if we can strengthen the basic systems so that the data are there and the good analysis is there, it will be easier to engage others.
Thank you. Well, Brianna, I know that speaking of strengthening health systems and taking it kind of to our national strategy, the FDA has a One Health strategic plan. And I know that you personally are also very dedicated to this issue of bringing in more diversity and including the social sciences. Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, sure. I think we were trying to diversify beyond just the biologists, beyond just the veterinarians and physicians, just because, you know, as has been mentioned, social drivers impact all the sectors. As we know, humans and our behavior impact the climate. We impact where we live. We impact the environment so far as our soil, how we conduct agriculture, things like that. So it's really important to include that in our strategy so that we can change behaviors and attitudes that benefit all the sectors that we've discussed, whether it's people, whether that's animals, whether that's plants, whether that's environment. So FDA recognized that One Health and using that concept to address a lot of the public health issues that are within our regulatory purview. This is why we did start a FDA One Health Steering Committee, so that we could use that concept when we come up with policies or guidances or standards that are within our regulatory purview. So we are glad to be part of forums just like this so we can hear ideas from the community and how we can make or enhance our practices and activities within our mission space.
Thank you so much. And I think that also brings us to sort of the economists. And Catherine, you mentioned behavioral economists, but the economic impact on health outcomes is incredibly important. The economic drivers for good health behavior also critically important. Laura, would you like to comment on the role of the socioeconomic economists as well as the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund?
Yeah, well, I was just in our session, I was just mentioning that all of these drivers that lead to pandemics are from, as was Brianna mentioned, behavioral, sociological activities. And really, to get at the root cause, we need to reassess how we value nature, how we value our natural resources. And currently, the main measure of a nation's wealth is through the gross domestic product, the GDP. And that measures the products and the services that are produced within a year. But that's just a very narrow slice of a nation's wealth. And if we started to factor in the nation's natural resources, the purity of its water, the clarity of its air, the condition of its soils, the health of the flora and fauna, the robustness, diversity of its ecosystems, ultimately affecting the food security for the people and the health of the people, that really is the true wealth of a nation. And so if we could develop a cohesive metric, and there is a group in China that developed what they called the gross ecosystem product. That was as a substitute for the gross domestic product. Perhaps it would be more palatable to have to add a One Health calculus to the gross domestic product that nations can then compare on how well they're doing on an annual or regular basis beyond just goods and services that have been so destructive to the natural world. So I think if we can get economists engaged in this and get some of these, larger, the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, to think beyond just goods and services, but include the natural resources of our planet in our wealth and health, that might then have a greater impact on trying to prevent some of these spillover events that can wreak complete havoc on the global economy.
Thank you. before we leave this topic, John, would you like to give us some summary thoughts? Hopefully we can get John on off mute. Okay, well, we'll come back to it. Next, I'd like to just bring in a question from the audience. Just thinking about the usual suspects in One Health. I think for decades it's been an academic concept, then it became more operationalized, especially with the tripartite and professional organizations coming in. And I think even now we're seeing the private industry and pharmaceutical companies beginning to really come to the front and employ or attempt to employ One Health approaches. But our audience has a very good point that the effects, the health effects, affect us as families, as individuals, as taxpayers. And so everyone needs to be on board. And I wonder what your thoughts are about getting this whole concept mainstreamed. We had a little help from John Oliver the last week, even as you saw a clip yesterday brought in. So I think we're starting to get mainstream. But I wonder if I could call on some of you to volunteer to talk about this. Maybe I'll start with Barbara.
How do we get more mainstream? I don't think it's going to be that hard for us right now, honestly. If it took a pandemic to get us on John Oliver, that's probably not a good sign that we weren't mainstream before. But I think that we have a real opportunity now to share our expertise in a way that's accessible to the public. I don't think that there's any question in people's minds the relevance of the science that we do anymore. I don't think that it's going to be a hard sell anymore. One of the speakers in our previous session made this point very clearly that now that we've had this sort of collective PTSD from COVID, that we can sort of look with a clearer perspective on what it will cost us if we don't make the investments that we need to for these types of studies. I think previously it's been hard to make the case that like it's worth knowing what's in our backyards. It's worth sequencing viruses to know what's out there just to get a baseline sense of what we should be worried about. I mean, these are things that are difficult to explain to the public. I don't think it's so difficult anymore. I think we just need to continue to hit that beat pretty hard. And I think that's part of our responsibility as scientists to make sure that our messaging comes through very clearly.
Thank you so much. I wonder, yeah, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, John. This is a really critical issue. We've got this group of, specialists and scientists, and many of us on this call who've been part of this forum, fall into that category. We're pretty well informed. But as the questioner asked, how do we get this to the rest of the community that we serve? How do we break down those barriers and integrate this more closely? We got enough problem dealing within our own professions on how to talk to one another. I think there's a great deal of promise in this initiative, that the National Academy of Medicine started on integrating the arts and humanities and the arts with science, education, and medicine. And when we start talking about the humanities, more than that's the social sciences plus, in engaging art and artists and people in humanities, then we might have some progress at breaking down that barrier and making these connections. So I think that's one potential approach to consider, expanding our view of interdisciplinary approaches.
Thank you. And if I could go to Michael Wilkes, you have a rich history of being a educator, an academic, a One Health champion, a physician, but also a reporter in many different venues in the mainstream press. So maybe you could share some ideas for us or some vision for where we can go.
Yeah, thanks, Jonna. I think that lots of the ideas that have been mentioned are crucial. I would start earlier downstream and begin to look at how One Health can be integrated into our educational system to improve health literacy and numerology, so that we have a public that really understands the interrelationships that everyone on this call understands around the environment and humans and animals and agriculture, et cetera. I also think we need to do much better with regard to how we communicate, not only what tools we're using in terms of social engagement, social technologies, as well as radio and television and newspaper, but also our ability to reach out to communities that perhaps have been less served during this epidemic. I think that the disparities that we saw in testing, the disparities that we're seeing in terms of infection, and now the disparities that we're seeing in terms of vaccination, all are a reflection of our inability to communicate and build trust with the community. And I think that for this pandemic, for future pandemics, reaching out to have stakeholders in some of these communities that we haven't been particularly successful is going to be super important.
Thank you. I think, it was brought up yesterday, recycling and dropping into the K through 12 education to really get that sensitivity and, beline my demographic. But I recall in the 70s that iconic commercial of an Indigenous person talking about littering in the US and, crying. And I'm starting to cry thinking about it. I never, ever littered again, but I don't know if those of you who lived here then and were aware of what was going on around you, we were full of litter at that time. And I don't see litter anymore where I live. So I think we need that iconic moment for One Health. Jonathan, what do you think?
So I think my hand was up for some of the previous comments, but maybe I can tie some of the discussion together and about how do we ensure there's, I think we don't forget this sort of transformative moment regarding COVID-19. And what I've not heard a lot of discussion about is societal values. I mean, the definition of One Health talks about optimizing outcomes from humans, animals, environment. But what those optimized outcomes look like it's not a scientific question, it's a societal value question. I think that one thing that we can do as the One Health community is start to articulate what those values are, and then start to educate people about those values. And I go back to ensuring that maintaining integrity of our natural ecosystems, preserving biodiversity is all part of those values, amongst many others, right? The sense of equity and food security and all those things. So I think there's a real opportunity here for us to create that sort of core values of One Health. Over.
Thank you. Maureen.
I don't think we could make much progress if we can't do a few things. One, if we can't translate the data that we're so familiar with into actions at the local level. If we don't invest in local public health infrastructure so that people who have to decide whether they buy food or they buy the inhaler for their asthmatic child, whether we can address those. And so I think One Health will progress if we address some of the root causes of disparities, if we engage truly with communities as partners and not as subjects. We can create that new environment for One Health if we work with communities to be our messengers rather than having some other person from some other state or federal government be that. And so if we take community participatory strategies truly seriously, then we'll make a difference, and then One Health will be understood. I agree with the literacy comments, but investing in our local public health infrastructure, I think we should be integral to what we're trying to do with One Health.
Yeah. I agree. And speaking of integral, I think, again, and Peter mentioned us all being in our nice little home offices, but most people around the world are living One Health every day. They aren't living the way we are all living who are on camera here. So Claire, I wonder if you'd like to make some comments about really integrating into societies and recognizing people who are living One Health every day.
Yeah, Yeah, and really, I think this goes right back to what Maureen just said. It's about engaging meaningfully and respectfully with communities and acknowledging what lived experience can contribute to this ongoing dialogue. I think that and I'm very guilty of this myself, talking about One Health and as an emerging concept or something that we can try to apply better. But in fact, this is something that we can also learn from other societies for whom it's much more of an everyday experience. Indigenous societies, people living very close to the wildlife or animal interface. And I think we can all do a bit better at least acknowledging that space in our conversations and trying to be a bit more aware, at least, of those opportunities.
Thank you. And Kaylee, I think you have some thoughts on this. And then I'll come to you, Tracy.
Yeah, I think actually I'll just kind of build on what Claire just mentioned, but making sure that we actually have space at the table for the people who are prioritized for the specific issue we're focusing on. So something that I think about a lot is there's collaborative advantage, but there's also collaborative inertia, and collaboration takes a lot of resourcing and a lot of energy. And we want to make sure that we're giving everyone an opportunity to be informed, but understanding that we can prioritize, and actually we must prioritize who is super critical to certain conversations and certain technical activities. Over.
Thank you. Tracy. Oh, you're on mute.
When it comes to trying to engage the public, my experience has been that people make assumptions about what's actually going on in terms of surveillance for zoonotic threats. And many of the, regular people I talk to just assume like the USDA is in charge of everything. I'm like, no, that's not true. They're simply unaware of the hierarchies we have within the United States in terms of One Health surveillance, and they just don't know that that we have major gaps. So that, I think we do need to get that message out to the public much more. I will say there's a bill coming out of Senator Gillibrand's office that I find very exciting in that, a lot of this One Health surveillance comes down to turf, money, who gets the money, what agency gets the money. And, that's why it really impedes progress. What's important about this bill is the focus is on everybody has to work together to address a zoonotic threat. And in this bill, instead of a single agency getting all the money, every agency involved gets one vote. And the group decides on how will these funds be spent to address this issue? Who's most important? Who can do this work? And I think that's pretty revolutionary. I haven't seen that in any legislation up until now. And I think that is definitely a way forward. So, and for the public and young people out there, man, advocate, I'm apolitical, but boy, I've gotten heavily involved in trying to address legislative changes. And that would be my message to the public out there. Get informed and call your representatives and demand to know why these things haven't been addressed.
Thank you. And I do think that the siloing that has evolved naturally in our government is a barrier to pulling things together. And I think Casey has a lot of experience. I'm going to come back to you, Casey and Ben, kind of thinking about federal budgets and other agencies. But before I do that, both Peters have been waiting patiently. So I'll go to Peter Daszak and then Peter Rabinowitz.
Yeah, well, I was touched by your comment about trash. And, I didn't see that ad because I was in the UK as a child, but we had similar celebrities doing similar work. And I do think that there's something really lacking in, and that's the public understanding of what's going on. And you saw in the chat box from Mark Smolinski, the outbreak exhibit at the Smithsonian, the movie Contagion, the comedy show with John Oliver. These things are really critical. I believe the reason why we've got people out there who have vaccine hesitancy, who don't believe that COVID came from nature, who don't understand how a bat virus can affect people in New York and LA, is because we don't talk about it in middle school and high school about where these pandemics come from. There will be a receptive audience to that. It needs to be in the curriculum now. And the science is pretty clear on all this. And I think we should, as scientists, we should stand out and speak up a bit more and say, look, this really is, it's something that we're doing to nature that's causing this problem. And it's something we can therefore fix. That message will be appreciated, I think. And you know, the conservation community did it in the 60s and 70s by appealing to people's emotion, the connection with wildlife. We need to do the same. It's not scientific, but it works. And we need to get that message out there. Over.
Thank you. Peter R.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, in terms of public awareness, I think we're all agreeing that the COVID-19 pandemic is an incredible opportunity to restructure things along One Health lines. But I think the other opportunity is that the young people are really thinking about climate change, and they're thinking about institutionalized racism and some of these disparities that have not been looked at for a long time. And I think we have to tie One Health to climate change, and we have to tie One Health to things like racism and social determinants of health, because it is so intertwined, but it's often not realized by many people. And so I think we need to tie it to that, not just to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. Ben, I'd like to turn to you. I think you have a very broad perspective, but you also can speak from the front lines. What are some of your closing thoughts?
Well, I like all the information that's being brought up about surveillance, and not so much creating a One Health surveillance system, but coordinating these systems that are in place. And people may not realize it, but from a human surveillance point of view, national surveillance is not a responsibility of the federal government. It's a responsibility of state governments. And so the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists is the governing body for that. CDC coordinates this and works with the states. And so there are data use agreements, and there's PII concerns and things like this. And this is what typically becomes a challenge for us in public health, to be able to coordinate our efforts with our other agencies. But I think this has to be done clearly. And I think that, this COVID epidemic really points this out to us. And I just want to reiterate what was said just now by Peter. I think that climate change is a huge concern, and that we need to be thinking about not just simply disease surveillance, but forecasting and modeling. And good models, to be certain, are built on surveillance data, but they have the benefit of being able to respond quicker than surveillance data has traditionally. And then also, just to give one other really brief example, with West Nile virus, for example, there are local outbreaks that occur, but typically before a public health response ever happens, the disease is already done and over. And this is because, we just don't have forecasting tools or the capacity to convince locals that what needs to be done now, and not waiting too late. And this is a complex problem. But I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Thank you. John, would you like to make a comment?
No, I just wanted to reemphasize something that Peter Rabinowitz mentioned, which was trying to tie in what the One Health movement beyond the research and academia, caucus, to the activist side of things. Those who are doing the climate change, who have been far more successful than us scientists.
Oop, I lost you there. Maybe we'll go to Laura. I think you had a closing thought.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jenna. Getting back to the issue of teaching our kids about One Health, I think an important point that our kids and everybody needs to know is that we live in a microbial world. Our bodies are mostly microbial. And in order for us to live better in our microbial world, we need to know about it, and we need to know how to live in it better without, sharing dangerous microbes with each other or with the environment or with the animals that we live with. So, these are critical bits of information, the science of it, that we need to understand in order to try to prevent further disease outbreaks.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to make a comment in this round?
Yes, I wanted to iterate on the importance of collaborating with our state and academic partners, departments of health and agriculture. What we find is when we share tools and broad communication of standard operating procedures, and that can be for any stage, collecting the isolates, sequencing the isolates, uploading the data, interpreting the data, this empowers them and they get full collaborative partners. And we can share this all through the internet and have open communications. And what we can do with the nationally, we can also do internationally. We can share all of these protocols and tools and then have standard validated methods that work, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They just use what already is working.
Thank you. And back to you, John. I think we've got you back.
No, thanks. I had an internet failure. So I was just speaking to what Peter Rabinovitz had said, and I was saying that in that call for a COVID-19 One Health Research Coalition, we do make reference to climate change activism, the activity around Black Lives Matter and racism on the widest scale, and how much that has achieved in a relatively short time compared to what research and academia has been able to do on some of these same subjects. So One Health is, which is really a huge approach, and I see One Health very closely tied to the climate change agenda in particular. We need to find a way of getting onto that platform, and that will be the vehicle which will take us where we need to. I can't certainly say how we should do that, but I guess we need to ask, because none of us have, particularly in that world, maybe some of us do operate in the world a bit here and there, but we're not really deep into it. And there's a whole different culture and ways of gathering knowledge and pushing things that is practiced in that world, which we need to get into.
Thank you. And it is time for us to wrap up. But before I do that, I'd just like to turn it back to Casey for one final thought about being a One Health integrator in a federal agency amongst the very siloed federal agencies with budgetary constraints that are also siloed. So what can we do?
And I think one important thing, as I said in my opening remarks, there's no one person, sector, or organization that can address all the One Health threats alone. We have to work together, and coordination is a key component of that. We've seen some real successes with our One Health coordination around COVID-19 that have really helped us learn some valuable lessons for the way forward. This is in line with our 2017 collaboration between CDC, the Department of Interior, and USDA, and multiple other agencies and departments, where we came up with a list of priority zoonotic diseases for our country. By the way, emerging coronaviruses were number 5 on that list back in December of 2017. We had some great action plans to advance One Health. And with some of the new legislation that's come out in 2021, the federal government is being directed to put together a national One Health framework to combat the threat of zoonotic diseases and advance emergency preparedness, and also to set up a formalized One Health coordination mechanism at the federal level. And I think that's going to be critically important in helping all the right agencies work together, continue to have shared priorities, have a shared framework to show what is needed in terms of resources to be able to address that. Because as of right now, there's not a dedicated budget line for One Health activities.
Thank you. I think that's critical. And I would just like to now thank all of the panelists. So we really appreciate this rich discussion. But I want to thank you. I want to thank all of you out there listening, because I also recognize that many of you, many of us, have been working using the One Health approach for decades. We've been in our own small ways, chipping away at these obstacles to collaboration and to really rich problem solving that reaches across community, demographic lines, and disciplinary lines. I do think that now is the time for One Health. It was probably the time a couple of decades ago, and maybe we wouldn't all be sitting here sheltering if we had done that, or if we had had the momentum. We were better communicators and were able to engender more political will earlier. But if we can't do it now, I think we really aren't rising to the challenge. This pandemic is a clarion call for us changing our behavior, not just in the way that we approach health problem solving, but in the way that we function on this earth. The world is suffering from so many syndemics. The pandemic is just one of the syndemics from which we are suffering. And it really takes us all to come together with our thoughts, our experiences, our social context to really come through with ideas that can be implemented, research that can be applied, and solutions that can be acceptable and palatable to the global community. And I believe One Health can do that, but without thinking in our own country about Black Lives Matter, about equity, inclusion, diversity, we will be leaving out the people that are living with the problems, and we will not solve them. So I would really just like to thank the entire community. I would like to ask you to continue to fight the good fight, but also to be a champion with your policymakers. We need leadership. We need leadership in all directions. We need to put down some of our guardrails around national boundaries, and certainly, as we've talked about over the last 3 days, disciplinary boundaries. All things are connected, and our thinking has to be connected, and no one of us, no one discipline, no matter how brilliant, is able to solve these problems. So with that, if I can thank our sponsors again, for this amazing opportunity to come to you. Thank you, the listening and participating groups, for really showing the world that One Health is so critical. It's my understanding that this workshop was one of the most highly subscribed health workshops ever sponsored by the National Academies, second only to masks, as far as I understand, and even more than 1,000 registrants over and above the vaccination one, which worries me, but I'm glad for One Health that that's the case. And so on behalf of myself, Jonna Mazet from the University of California, Davis, Casey Barton-Berevish from the CDC, we were so honored to be your co-chairs. We have our amazing committee. I hope those slides are up, but I can tell you in my Zoom platform, I can't tell. That we had just an amazing organizing committee, the Forum on Microbial Threats, and the One Health Action Collaborative, the leadership of both of those that were instrumental in bringing you all of these amazing speakers. And then finally, Julie Pavlin, Julie Lau, and Charles Minicucci were just fabulous, as well as Alex in the background, keeping all of the technical difficulties to a minimum and making this as seamless as possible. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Continue to keep up the good One Health championing work.